a quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in. Let the outside world dissolve and gently descend into tonight's world. In 1991, Bob Lazar appeared in a press conference-style interview, answering a long chain of questions about his claims of working around unusual aircraft and a material he called Element 115. What matters here is not rumors around him, but the specific questions he was asked and the specific answers he gave in that room. Some moments are clear and detailed, especially when he talks about how he says the craft was powered. Other moments are vague, or the wording is hard to hear, and we have to be careful about what we assume. Tonight, we follow the interview as a documentary record, building a calm timeline of the exchange and keeping close to what was said. Tonight, we go through Bob Lazar, Unseen interview from 1991. The segment begins mid-conversation. Someone asks, "What about something the questioner calls an alien Bible?" The questioner is asking about a supposed briefing or story, something like an origin narrative that he is calling an alien Bible. Lazar answers carefully. He says he does not know what the questioner means by an alien Bible. He says some briefings he read included information that claimed humans were the product of some kind of genetic modification. He does not present it as something he can prove. He says it is simply what he remembers reading. He says beyond that, he does not know more. A follow-up question comes immediately. The question refers to a date Lazar had mentioned, a time when the beings were supposed to return. Someone asks, something supposed to happen when they return? Lazar answers, he has no idea. He says it was just a date. He says the date was written in a way that made no sense to him. He describes it as something like 601 or 30-something. He says it looked like it was in a different numerical system. He repeats that beyond the claim that these beings created us and did genetic upgrades, he does not know more. He adds that this is only true if the information is correct. The focus shifts to physics. Someone says they are interested in a clearer explanation of the power generation. The question tries to connect antimatter, gravity waves, amplification, and the idea of folding space. It is a long question, asked in a technical way. The person wants the relationship between antimatter and what Lazar calls a gravity force field. Lazar answers, it is a lengthy explanation. He says he can give a brief overview. He offers to send a paper for a deeper description. Then he lays out the sequence as he claims he understood it. He says the reactor provides electrical power. He says it also provides a base gravity wave that is then amplified. He says it does this by interacting matter and antimatter. He says the process begins with an accelerated proton. He says that proton is injected into a piece of element 115. He says the element spontaneously generates what he calls anti-hydrogen. He says that antimatter is reacted in a small area. He describes it as a compressed gas, possibly compressed atmospheric gas. He says antimatter reacting with matter produces energy, mainly heat. He says the heat is converted into electrical energy by a thermionic generator. He says it appeared to be 100% efficient, which he admits is difficult to believe. Then he returns to what he calls the second function. He says the reactor provides the basic gravity wave. He says the wave appears at the upper sphere of the amplifier. He says it is tapped off with something like a waveguide, similar to a microwave system. He says it is amplified and focused. A follow-up question is asked. Someone asks how the electrical energy is related to the amplification of the gravitational energy. The questioner wants the connection between the electricity and the gravity system. Lazar answers, the electrical energy is transmitted without wires. He compares it to a Tesla setup. He says each subcomponent seemed tuned to the frequency the reactor operated at. He says the amplifiers receive power the way a Tesla coil can transmit power. He mentions lighting fluorescent bulbs as an analogy. He checks if that answers the question. The questioner confirms that it does. Lazar adds that the waveguide carries the basic wave. He repeats that it is similar to a microwave amplifier. He offers again that he could send drawings. He says that is basically how it works. The topic moves to element 115 in Lazar's possession. Someone says they understand he took some 115 home to do testing. They ask if he took it. Lazar answers he obtained it. They ask if he documented his testing. Lazar answers he did. He says he documented it mostly on videotape. Another person brings up something that was apparently said the night before. A name is mentioned, and the question claims the material was stolen from Lazar. The question says it was stolen back. Lazar repeats the phrase, stolen back. He says there is another level to that. He says that for now, it is in private hands. He does not explain further. The interviewer returns to a claim about 115 as fuel. The question says a small wedge, about 2 inches long, could run the ship up to 30 years. Someone asks how that translates into distance. How long would that be? Lazar answers, it depends on the energy level. He says the more energy you expend, the faster you consume fuel. He compares it to any modern machine. He says it depends on how much energy you request. A question mentions Dr. Teller, likely Edward Teller. Someone asks what Teller's relationship was. Then it asks if Teller might be working on antimatter weaponry. Lazar answers he does not know. He says Teller was certainly involved in some way. He says he forgets the exact title. He recalls something like chief consultant. He says he does not think anyone was involved in antimatter weaponry. But he says there was beam weapon work, and Teller had been involved with that. Lazar mentions a project he associates with Teller. He says Teller's last project at Livermore, or Los Alamos, was something he calls Super X Caliber. He describes it as a nuclear bomb detonated in orbit. He says fiber optic light guides would direct X-rays to incoming warheads. He calls it Teller's pet project. He says he does not think Teller jumped to antimatter weapons. A question from the back asks about the craft. Lazar says he worked on, sometimes called a sport model. Someone asks what he thinks was on level 3. Then it asks, bluntly, where the bathroom was. Lazar answers, he does not know if anything was on level 3. Then he corrects himself. He says he does not know if there were any bathrooms on level 3. He says he can only guess. He says he imagines there was navigational equipment. He says perhaps their version of a computer. He says he saw nothing else that controlled the amplifiers. Another question asks, broadly, how mankind could develop this type of machine. Lazar answers, he really does not know. He says it would require access to certain materials or new manufacturing techniques. He says until those problems are solved, knowing the idea is not enough. He implies it would be useless without the ability to build it. Someone asks how many other materials might be necessary besides 115. They ask what other materials he knows of that were contained on the ship. Lazar answers 115 might be it. He suggests the rest could be a matter of improving manufacturing. He mentions making things smaller. He mentions increasing technology. He mentions running a small accelerator at higher energy. He says he does not know about the metallurgy. He says he does not think exotic metals are necessary. He says they might be used, but he does not think they are required. He says you could make a craft out of aluminum if necessary. He says he does not know what part material choice plays. Someone asks, what about the saucer shape? Is there significance to the geometry? Is it about resonance? Lazar answers, it is not about resonance. He says the shape is important because a high voltage field appears at most of the craft. He says most edges are rounded. He describes an upper bump and a ring. He says there is a darker ring that acts as an insulator. He says above that ring, in the upper section, high voltage does not appear. He notes he is speaking about one craft and does not know about the rest. Someone asks, any technology from the aliens is something we can do today? They ask, if we have advanced to their degree? Lazar answers, there are some basic things. He mentions the idea of a small accelerator. He says we have things like that. He says in terms of anything really advanced, the main thing is control of gravity. He says beyond manipulating gravity, that is about it. Someone asks, what about the craft's skin? The question brings up reports like Roswell. It mentions a thin metal skin that was hard to damage. They ask, Lazar, what the construction was like. They ask about thickness. Lazar answers, he called it metal. He says he cannot say that is what it was. He says he called it metal because it felt cold. He says it was somewhat lustrous. A follow-up asks if he noticed any place where it was thinner, like an edge. They ask if it was thinner than standard aircraft metals. Lazar answers from the outside, you cannot tell. He says, when you walk inside, the archways are about 4 inches thick. He says you cannot tell how thin the skin is. He says you cannot tell if it is exotic. The questions return to element 115. Someone asks about his contention that it could not be made on Earth. They ask if, with the right bombardment speed, the right target shape, and the right containment, it could be made. Lazar answers with enough time, you could probably make a small amount. He compares it to how long it takes to make certain elements in an accelerator. He suggests it may be that technology has not advanced enough yet. He says you would have to add protons and neutrons into an existing atom. He says you would have to do it essentially one at a time. He says not all attempts would work. Then the questioner asks how they got their first piece of it. If it was from a dead star, how did it come from there? Lazar answers, he thinks it was naturally occurring somewhere on their planet. He says that is a guess. He says it would be stable. Someone asks, what about flight tests? Are you aware of any tests done as of the time you were there? Lazar answers, he was told they did not take them any great distance. He says they stayed right outside. He describes them as short, local tests. Then someone asks him about a rumor of a crash or accident during testing. Lazar answers, no. Someone asks, what about a working agreement with aliens? If there was such an agreement, why did they not give a manual? Why did we have to work so hard at back engineering? Lazar answers, he has no idea. He says he does not know if there was any assistance. He says it almost seems like there had to be. But he says he does not know. He says his information did not indicate that. Someone asks, what about security? It says there was supposedly only 500 pounds of the material. How could anyone get some out? Lazar describes a machining process. He says the material has to be machined into discs. He says discs are stacked, cut into a cone, and sliced. He says that work is done at Los Alamos. He says he is not sure if Los Alamos knew what they were doing. He says they thought they were developing a new armor. He says because he worked at Los Alamos and knew people there, that is how he obtained some. Someone asks, what about a project called Looking Glass? They ask about the relationship between gravity and time. Lazar answers, gravity and time are almost the same thing. He says Looking Glass dealt with using gravity to distort time. He says he knows very little about it. He says they were talking about milliseconds, or even less, microseconds. He says it was not like looking back to see who killed Kennedy. The interviewer asks about the craft again. They ask if it is the Scout craft. They ask if it looks like the Adamski picture, with 3 domes underneath. Lazar answers, he is not sure about the Adamski reference. He says the craft he is talking about looks like one of the more common craft. Someone asks, he saw others? Were there 9 out there? Lazar answers, he saw 9 total. He says that is the only one he got close enough to. Someone asks, what if he saw the one with 3 domes or 3 balls underneath? They ask, if anyone gave any indication about who was driving. They ask, if he got any information about who was inside. Lazar answers, he assumed it was humans piloting. He says it could have been remote control. He says during one test flight he saw on the ground, they were in radio communication with someone. He assumed someone was in the craft. He says it could be possible it was remote. He adds that he assumes the seats were retrofitted, or that someone could sit on the floor. Another person asks a multi-part question. They ask if he is familiar with names like Howard Menger and Otis Carr, and their ideas about saucer design. They ask how those devices generate gravity fields compared with what Lazar described. They also ask why commercialization has not been possible with so many patents. Lazar answers bluntly that those designs do not work. Someone asks, what about forces on pilots inside the craft? Are there any G-forces encountered? Lazar answers not at all. A question refers to earlier interviews. It says Lazar seemed to feel Area 51 or the test site was slipshod in how it did research. They ask if he can comment. It also asks what he could tell about other types of ships he saw that he felt were alien in origin. Lazar answers the research at S4 was slipshod, mainly because it was being done from a military point of view. He says if anything, it was a weapons development program. He says they were more concerned with duplicating the hardware than back engineering the technology. He says they were not taking a scientific approach, and that caused dissension. He says he does not remember the second part of the question. When it is repeated, he says he only saw them and they varied in shape. He says he was told they had the same identical power and propulsion system. He says that is the extent of his knowledge. He confirms the shapes varied completely. Someone asks, what about the idea of the military working with aliens? Did he ever get an inference it was positive or negative? When people talked about aliens, was it a positive or negative slant? Lazar answers they really did not talk about it. He says the only time he heard anybody mention an alien, someone called something a gourd. He says he heard it in the middle of a conversation, and then the talking stopped when he walked up. He says that was the only thing. Someone asks, what about the interior of the sport model? The question mentions a power source in the center and small seats low to the ground. They ask about consoles or displays or instrumentation. Lazar answers nothing like that. Then he describes what he called a console. He says on the bottom level, there are 3 amplifiers in a triad formation. He says directly above each one is something he called a console. He says he thinks that is a secondary part to the amplifier. He offers an analogy in audio terms, like an amplifier and a speaker hanging underneath. He says he could not find any kind of control. Someone asks, there seemed to be any place or any need for life support. Lazar answers, not that was obvious to him. Someone asks, what 2 things? How do they navigate? And how do we converse with them? Lazar answers, he has no idea how they navigate. He repeats that he thinks whatever controls the configuration of the amplifiers is the focusing and is basically navigation. He says that is most probably on the upper level that he did not get to look at. As for conversation, he says your guess is as good as his. Someone asks, what about local propulsion? What was the local means of propulsion? Lazar answers, local propulsion is them balancing on an out-of-phase gravity wave. He says it is not as stable as you would think. He says when the craft took off, it wobbled to some degree. He compares it to modern vertical takeoff craft like a Harrier, and says those are much more stable. He says in the Omicron configuration, that is the mode of travel. Then he mentions the Delta configuration. He says that is where they use the 3 amplifiers. He says those are the only 2 methods he knows about for moving the craft. Someone asks, 1 pilot can pilot the craft, or does it take 3? Lazar answers, he does not know. Someone asks, what about the idea of an island of stability? The questioner says some theories suggest stability around elements 113 to 116. Lazar answers apparently that is true. He adds that they should reach a stability somewhere up around 220. He says whether those elements will ever be synthesized or found naturally is unknown. Someone asks what he thinks of monuments on Mars. They ask if he thinks we have bases. Lazar answers, no, he does not think we have bases. He says the monuments of Mars are interesting. He says that is about the most he can say. He says they are suspicious. He says he does not know until there is more information. He says he has seen pictures. He says a recent Mars probe is taking low-altitude photographs of those. He says everyone will know in about a year. Someone asks, what about perception of time and space? Is time, length, width, and height the same aboard the craft as off it? Lazar answers, as long as you are on the craft, everything seems normal. He says time flows at a normal rate. He says, if you compare time of someone in the craft to someone off the craft, there will be a definite difference. He says anything where gravity is involved causes differences. He gives an example of astronauts coming back and having a slight difference in time due to gravity differences. Someone asks, he learned of any other well-known civilian scientists involved? Lazar answers, not involved in this, but involved in gravity work. He says the person is at Los Alamos and they have had some contact. When asked to name names, he says he would rather not. He says so far, no one is bothering that person, and he is sure the person wants to keep it that way. Someone asks, what about reports that the inside of an alien craft can be much larger? Lazar answers, he has heard stories like that, but has not experienced it. A question shifts into higher physics. It mentions theories about an 11-dimensional universe with 7 dimensions rolled up. Someone asks, is the technology operates on any principle related to that? Lazar answers his main problem with that is that once you start creating other dimensions, it becomes an excuse. He says particle physics does that too. He says when they cannot figure out something, they make up particles. He jokes that you can do that with dimensions as well. He says the bottom line is, the answer to everything is always simple. He says there is no need for an 11-dimensional universe. He says the technology works in what is essentially a 4-dimensional universe. He says there is no need for extra dimensions. Someone asks, what about the bus ride? Someone asks, is he works from Las Vegas, and if he went in a bus? Then a person asks about a facility on the east side of Groom Lake. Have you ever been over there? Lazar answers, no. He has never been over there. Someone returns to the earlier time question. They ask about being inside a craft under power versus being outside. They point out Lazar was never on the craft when it was powered. Lazar answers by the fact that the screen became transparent and other things were operational. He assumes some power was generated. Someone asks how long he was part of the S4 project. It also asks how key of a person he was on the science team. Lazar answers he was probably there only 6 months, maybe 4 months. He says it is hard to remember. He says as far as being key, he is sure he was the last rung on the ladder. He says because no one had really gotten anywhere. They were looking to him for fresh ideas. He says he did not really have any, because he did not know what was going on or where they had been. He says it was a very disorganized group. He says it was frustrating. Someone asks, Element 115 has emission lines. Does it have emission lines spectroscopy? Lazar answers, he imagines it does, like every other element. He says he has not seen the spectral analysis. He says they did do it, but he is not sure if he saw it. He says he saw neutron bombardment tests and density measurements. He says he is sure they carried out that test. He says he would not be able to identify the lines. He says he cannot remember after 4 years. A longer comment appears in the room about heavy elements and where they are found. Someone argues that not every element on the periodic table is naturally found on Earth, and they mention technetium as an example. Someone asks, aliens might have come here for resources. The questioner suggests uranium as an example, and asks if anything Lazar saw supports that idea. Lazar answers, he does not know. He says uranium is certainly a valuable element. He says he does not know. Someone asks, he got to see any aliens at all? Lazar answers, no. A question returns to the wobble. Someone asks if it was similar to the Billy Meyer films. Lazar answers, he does not think he has seen any motion. Then he says he did see a film where something flew around a tree. He says some of those look unbelievably fake. He says the one flying around a tree looked like it was hanging from a string. He says he has mixed feelings about it. Someone asks, what about an alleged conflict in the UFO community and whether Lazar has any opinion? Lazar answers, he really does not have an opinion. He says he just repeats things. He says he does not know. Someone asks, there were any weapons on these ships? Lazar answers, apparently there is one. He says he was not involved in the project that dealt with it. Someone asks what his next video will be. Lazar answers, it is not really a next video. He says the video he made is being redone by another company. He says they liked it and are redoing the graphics and making it more technical. He says he is serving as a technical advisor. He says for the most part, it is 60 to 70% identical. He says the group is involved in special effects. Someone asks, what about electromagnetic effects, like an EMP, and whether the craft systems could cause that? Then the questioner asks what type of weapon the craft has. Lazar answers, it is some sort of directed energy weapon. He says he thinks it is more like a particle weapon, possibly neutron. Someone asks how many levels S4 has, 1 or 2. Lazar answers he knows there is one because he was on one. He says he cannot remember if there is direct mention of a lower level. He says he was not allowed to roam freely. Someone asks, what about his education? Lazar answers, it varies. He says as far as electronic technology, he says his degree is from Caltech. He says physics is from MIT. Someone asks when he graduated. They ask if he went to Pierce College. Lazar answers, yes, he did. He says he is terrible at dates. He says he was at Pierce around 1976. He says around 1977 or 1978. He went to Northridge for some classes. He says he was at Caltech and then MIT. A question says critics suggest there is not a Department of Naval Intelligence as shown on his record. They ask him to address that. Lazar answers, he has heard that. He says the bottom line is, if you write the zip code number on the bottom, it gets to somewhere in the Navy. He says other people checked into it. He says a person managed to trace it down through the IRS. He says he does not know if there is a department of that, but that is what he got sent. Someone challenges again and says the zip code was unused. Lazar answers someone had correspondence with someone in the Navy through that address. He says he has seen enough information where the zip code works. He says that is all he knows. Someone asks why he thinks it is legitimate. Lazar answers, because certain elements are correct. He mentions the amount of money. He says no one would know the amount except him and people involved. Someone asks, what two unrelated questions? Are they silent or noisy? And who signed his paychecks? Lazar answers, as far as sounds, there is a slight hiss before they take off and up to a certain altitude. He says it sounds like a high voltage hiss. He says that is all he has heard. He says he has heard reports of weird sounds, but he never encountered that. As for who signed his paycheck, he says there was a signature, but he does not know whose. He says he never concerned himself with tracing it down. Someone asks if there was a company name on the check. Lazar answers, the check said the Department of Naval Intelligence. Someone asks, a craft entering our atmosphere would create a loud report. Lazar answers, it depends on the velocity it enters. He says, if it manipulates gravity, it does not have to slingshot in. He says it can come in at low speed and not heat up. He says, if you travel supersonic, you get a report. If you do not, you do not. Someone asks what the approximate percentage of civilian versus military personnel. It also asks job categories. Lazar answers civilian personnel were scientific in nature. He says military personnel were security. He says it was a small percentage of scientific to military. He says there might be offices and underground levels. He says he was escorted right to where he worked. He says he had limited movement. Someone asks where he ate. Lazar answers the only place he ate was out of Area 51. He says if there was a cafeteria at S4, he never ate there. Someone asks who he came and went with. Lazar answers He usually came with Dennis Mariani, his supervisor. He says he was not on a full-time swing. He says he flew in usually between 4 and 5 at night and left by 11. He says he was there a short time each day. Someone asks how many people were on the bus from Groom Lake to Papoose. Lazar answers very few. He says it was him and Dennis. He says occasionally one other person. Someone asks, what about a person named Barry? Lazar answers, he does not think he ever saw Barry on the bus. Someone asks, there is a chance any of the workers might defect or speak out. Lazar talks about trying to get a hold of Barry. He describes an incident after the story hit the news. He says they got a call from Dennis and a meeting was arranged at the Union Plaza Hotel. He says he brought 3 people. He says he saw one of the security personnel, and then Dennis did not acknowledge him. He says they could not get Dennis's attention. He says he left. He suggests someone knew of the conversation. He says that may have been where Dennis wanted to say something. Someone asks, Lazar used hypnotic regression to get at details. They ask his impression of hypnotic regression as a tool. Lazar answers, it is a tool and probably reasonable. He says there are specifics where they contend you can reread a document as if you were there. He says he was mainly interested in schematics and drawings. He says he did hypnosis with a hypnotherapist in town. He says he was able to redraw a lot of schematics and engineering drawings. He says, as a tool for that, it seems to work. A person in the room makes a comment. They say, when they were 12 years old, they saw a daylight flying disc that looked like Billy Meyer photographs. They say later Billy Meyer took a photo. They say Lazar said the sport model looked like the same photo. They say it tied it together for them. Then they ask Lazar what year he graduated from MIT and if he got a PhD. Lazar answers, it is a master's degree. He says the year was probably 1982. He says he left there and went to Los Alamos. Someone asks, he can talk about mind control that people said was used on him. Lazar asks what mind control. He describes that when he was first brought there, they had a doctor or nurse in a medical setup. He says after he signed papers, he went in, and they did what he perceived as an allergen test. He says they put a grid on his arm and different chemicals. He says he was given something to drink. He says it smelled like pine. He says people jumped on that and said it was a mind control substance. He says he thinks, if anything, it was an anti-allergen drug. Someone asks, what about threats? Lazar answers plenty of threats. When asked what kind, he mentions loss of pension and jail time as part of signing paperwork. He says after they caught them when he brought John and other people, they threatened him. He says it did not get much reaction. He says they threatened his wife at the time. He says they threw out everything they could without physically attacking him. Someone asks why they did not arrest him. Lazar answers, they cannot arrest him because they would have to admit the material is classified. He says they would have to release it. He asks why they did not kill him. He says he does not know. He speculates it could have to do with how he got the job or connections. He says he does not know. Someone asks, there were any contractor names, departments, divisions, signs on the wall, or companies? Lazar answers, no. He says he knows EG and G had nothing to do with it. He says he mentioned EG and G once because he was interviewed in the EG and G building. He says Dennis said they do not let those people anywhere near this place. Someone asks, he ever considered taking them to court to stop harassment. Lazar asks what evidence he would use. He says it is hard enough to prove to the public. He says taking it to court is impossible. He says it would be a public forum to discredit him. Someone asks, what about a class action or the ACLU? Lazar answers, you still need evidence. He says even if he pulled out a piece of 115, what does that prove? He says there is nothing. He says they had their bases covered. There is a comment about something that happened to him in Las Vegas around 1990. Lazar asks what they mean, and he responds that it was his own fault, and he does not dwell on it. Someone asks how someone would get a piece of paper explaining the physical properties and formulas. Then Lazar is asked if he is being watched currently. Lazar answers, there had been nothing for several years. He says the other day, one of his phone lines was not working, and the other was breaking up. He says the phone company checked and said there was nothing in the house wiring. He says they checked at the pole and said his individual line was cut, and the other wires were stripped and twist-tied together. He says he thought maybe someone tapped in. He says they filed a report. He says that is one form of documentation. Someone asks, what about records at Caltech and MIT disappearing? They ask if he can reconstruct coursework and professors. Lazar answers, yes. He says he has people he went to school with. He says George spoke to some of them and even flew with him and spoke to colleagues. He says he could. When asked if he could reveal professors, he says he could. He names a Dr. Duxler and a Hostfield, spelling uncertain. He says Hostfield was at MIT and Duxler was at Caltech. He says they remember him. Someone asks who Barry is. Lazar answers, Barry is a guy he worked with on the buddy system. He says you have ideas to bounce off. He gives a last name like Castillo or Castile. He says Barry was there a long time and probably still there. Someone asks, Lazar got information from Barry. Lazar answers, Barry taught him everything they had done up to date. Someone asks, they mentioned other facilities around the country. Lazar answers, no. He says they did mention that this was the place all of this stuff was brought to. He says it was purposely condensed there to keep an eye on everything. Someone asks, what about test personnel crashing craft? Did he know causes? Lazar answers, he did not read about any crashes during tests. He says you would think there would be some. He says he did not. Someone asks, he was affiliated with any student houses at Caltech? Lazar answers, no. Someone asks, what about Pine Gap in Australia? Did he read anything? Lazar answers, he does not keep up with UFO information. He says officially he never read anything. He says he heard the name Pine Gap mentioned. He says he has not heard anything about it. Someone asks, anyone approached him with a screenplay offer? Lazar answers, yes, constantly. He mentions Columbia Pictures. He says they wanted to do it. He says his main problem is that if they make a movie, it has to be exactly what happened. He says he does not want a Hollywood version. Someone asks why they recruited someone with a master's instead of a PhD. Lazar answers, that is a good question. He says there are plenty of people more qualified. He says there are only two reasons he can think of. He says either Dr. Teller pushed him into the position, or the fact that he approaches problems from a strange angle, off the beaten path. He says it is one of those two reasons, unless there is a third he does not know. Someone asks, they will ever release this information? If not, how will it come out? Lazar answers, Hopefully, it is not this way. He says hopefully there will be a release of information eventually. He says they have been keeping the secret for so long. He suggests they might need a staged incident to get them off the hook. He jokes about pushing a flying saucer out of a plane and saying it crashed. Someone asks how they overcome forces and rapid changes. Lazar answers, those do not apply once you distort gravity. He says having a gravity amplifier distorts time and space. He says there is no interaction. He says there would be no effect on humans inside. He says no effect inside at all. Someone asks, Lazar's education permitted him to believe he could contribute? They ask if he thought he could make a meaningful contribution. Lazar answers, he was always in serious doubt they would get rid of him. He says there was not much he could contribute. He says he was not an expert in any particular field. He says he made some contributions, like determining what element they were dealing with. Someone asks, his education was traditionally grounded. They ask how surprised he was when shown the hardware. They ask how long it took him to accept it. Lazar answers very surprised. He says even when reading the documentation, the alien question never entered his mind. He says he kept pushing it off. He says he had a mental block. He says he thought flying saucers were ridiculous. He says he held out to the very end. He says until they finally said it. Someone asks, he ever heard Air Force or military squadron numbers? Lazar answers, he probably did, but cannot remember. He says there was not much idle banter. Someone asks, what about amplifying the gravitational field? Could you enlarge the area, move more than just the craft? Could you move two craft under the same power source? Lazar answers, it is possible as long as both are in the field being emitted. He says he does not know how energy relates to mass or amount of space. He says it is a guess. Someone asks, what about control instrumentation? Lazar answers, he does not know. He repeats he assumes control systems were above. He says he dealt only with the power-hungry components. Someone asks, there were periods he cannot account for. Did he ever not remember what he was doing? Lazar answers, he mentioned something like that, and it was bent different ways. He says there were times he left and he was drowned in information. He says when he got back home, he could not remember what day anything happened. He says he did not forget big chunks of knowledge. He says he was just overloaded. Someone asks, what him to describe something he saw through a small window in a hangar door. They ask, what he saw? Lazar answers, it has to be taken in context. He says he was walking down a hall. He says the hangar doors have small 9-inch square windows with wire mesh. He says he looked in one and was told to keep his head forward. He says he saw the backs of two guys. He says they were talking to a child, or what he thought was a small child. He says when he told John, John said it was an alien. Lazar answers, he does not know what it was. He says it was a glance. He says if it had a rounded head and big eyes, he would say it. He says he cannot say that. He says it was a small person or small being they were talking to. He says he does not think anyone could bring kids down there. He says it could have been a model. He says it could have been a life-sized model to test relationships like seats and access. He says it does not necessarily mean it was living. Someone asks how this body of knowledge affected him emotionally or spiritually. They ask if he is frightened by the implications. Lazar answers, it is difficult to put a finger on it. He says there is so little evidence. He says 99% of what he hears he does not believe. He says it is ridiculous. He says he thinks 99% of sightings are not flying saucers. He says most people are watching planes. He describes parachuted flares fired near Papoose Lake. He says they are orange. He says they are on a modified small hot air balloon, so the flare keeps it afloat longer. He says he does not know if that is disinformation or practice. He says he thinks that is what many people are seeing. A person responds that they saw lights close and moving. They ask about lights going on and off. Lazar answers they cannot shut them off. He says what happened is the craft probably pitched and the bottom faced the observer. He says it looked like the light was off because you cannot see it from the bottom. Someone asks why they generate light. Lazar answers, it operates like a fluorescent tube. He says with a powerful radio transmitter, a neon tube will light up. He says atoms get excited and release a photon. He says that is what is going on. Someone asks what him to elaborate on the word containers and why it is used. Lazar answers he cannot guess. He says he can only say the way it was written. He says if he speculates, people will lean that way. He says that is not fair. Someone asks, documents ascribe a purpose to genetic manipulations. Lazar answers, no. He says it was not a large briefing. He says 90% of what he read dealt with his project. He says the briefing material on other things was like 2 sheets of paper. He says it was probably to alleviate curiosity. Someone asks what he knows about the aurora. Lazar answers, he saw it once on the way out there. He says the only reason he calls it aurora is Dennis told him on the bus. He says it makes an unbelievably loud sound. He says it sounded like the sky is tearing. He says he understands it uses a liquid methane-powered engine. He says information got out in Aviation Week and Popular Science. He describes it as a long, slender craft with short wings and a square exhaust with little vanes. He says it is quite large. He says he described the sound to others, including someone from a model corporation. He says he probably has more information than Lazar does. Someone asks, what about abduction reports and blue beams of light? They ask if the amplifiers could lift something off the ground. Lazar answers any of the gravity amplifiers could do that. He says that is not a problem. He says the craft can operate on one amplifier in Omicron mode, hovering. He says the other 2 would be free. He says they could pick up cows or whatever. He says on the craft he worked on, there was no provision for anything coming through the bottom. He says he does not know. Someone asks, blue light is consistent with what you would expect. Lazar answers, that is more consistent than orange. He says nitrogen atmosphere should glow blue. Someone asks, the ship appeared to be cast metal. Lazar answers, not cast. He says it was more like injection molded. He says there were no sharp objects. He says even where seats meet the floor is curved. He says the top of everything. He says it looked like it was made of wax, heated until it melted, then cooled. He says everything is perfectly rounded. He says if it contains a high voltage field, rounded edges prevent corona discharge. Someone asks how you can focus a gravity wave on something millions of miles away. Lazar answers, he does not think they focus it that far. He says he thinks trips are made in several small jumps. He says the precision required would exceed anyone's technology over huge distances. He says if you do a jump of 1,000 miles, that is tremendously impressive. He says he cannot see them jumping a light year. Someone asks, What about small silver balls associated with craft? Lazar answers, he never heard of them. A question mentions video from Mexico during an eclipse and a pulsation around UFOs. They ask if that could be attributed to technology. Lazar answers, it is possible, an optical distortion. Someone asks, what about something in his video about anesthetizing the human brain and breaking it with rock music or stimulus? Lazar answers, he does not know what else to call it, but anesthetizing or hypnosis. He says anything that distracts attention at a high level could prevent it. He says a stimulant drug could prevent relaxation. He compares it to hypnosis in general. He says, if you are not in a relaxed state, you will not get into that level of consciousness. He says, if you are alert, it will be hard to cause that effect. He adds that is only if the information is correct. Someone asks what context that information was in. Lazar answers, it dealt with biological effects of the aliens on the human race. He says it was in part of autopsy reports. He says they had a single organ in their body cross-sectioned. He says there were comments about different functions of the brain. He says that is where it came up. He compares it to making up explanations. Someone asks, to verify, have you ever gone by any other name? Lazar answers, no. He says he has been Bob Lazar from birth, as far as he knows. Someone asks, he has any other biological information on the aliens besides one organ? Lazar answers, no. He says that was essentially from looking at a photograph. A person comments about Billy Meyer. They say the beings Meyer described were full size. They note Lazar said the craft he worked on was small. They ask about the idea that large beings obtained the craft from smaller creatures. Lazar asks which craft. He says he does not know. He says the one he worked on was small and uncomfortable for a 5 to 6 foot person. Someone asks, the other craft were built by the same beings, or if there were different origins. Lazar answers, he thinks one had a projectile hole through it. He says he does not believe it was shot down. He says he thinks it might have been stood up on its side to see how the metal would react to a high-speed projectile. Someone asks, what about security? How did they act? Did he ever talk to them? Lazar answers, he never talked to them. He says he cannot stand them. He says they went only so far. He says they did not want to talk. He says they seemed like they thought the scientists were a nuisance. Someone asks, he saw any hardware, nuts and bolts, wires? Did it look like ours? Lazar answers, as far as fastening devices, everything was formed together. He says there were no nuts and bolts. He says there were no connecting wires, even between electrical systems. Someone asks how energy went from one area to another. Lazar answers, the best guess is it operated like a Tesla coil. He says a transmitter and a receiver tuned to the frequency. Someone asks, there were lights on a console with plastic? Lazar answers, no lights. Someone asks, the craft was monolithic construction? Lazar answers, yes. Someone asks, what him to recount what happened the night he and a group were discovered on the perimeter? Lazar begins by saying, John is a nice guy, but tends to add color. He describes that his wife at the time and her sister wanted to go out and see what they could see, because there was a test flight coming up. He says John showed up at the house and joined. He says they rented a car because he usually had sports cars with only 2 seats. They drove out. They waited until dusk to drive up the road. He says they were careful not to hit the brakes because they did not want brake lights. He says they knew security was up on the road. they drove in 5 to 7 miles. He says they brought equipment like Geiger counters, a telescope, and a pistol. They stopped. He says his sister-in-law stepped on the brakes. They waited. Someone opened a door and the dome light went on. He says 2 different sets of headlights lit up on either side of them. They realized they were caught. He corrects a detail as he speaks. He says they hopped in the car and tried to get back to the exit. He says they got about halfway and there were vehicles. He says they stopped and realized they were not getting out. He says as they got close to the top, they saw another vehicle pull in. He says he ran out into the desert. He says the rest of the story is from the people there, because he was laying on the ground. He says John set up the telescope quickly. He says John tried to make an excuse. He says the security people asked what they were doing. He says John said they were looking at Jupiter. He says the security people told them to get out of there. He says the security people backed off and stopped a few hundred yards away. He says he came back out of the desert. He says he joked about being lucky they did not see other people. He says the security people heard it. He says the security people went to arms, thinking there were others. He says they had them under gunpoint. He says they were sitting on the bumper, talking. He says they saw a little green light drop on the ground and roll. He says it was a night vision scope. He says someone picked it up and it disappeared. He says that is when they got scared. He says they realized the security were close. He says they drove off. He says at the top of the road, a Lincoln County sheriff was there. He says the sheriff wanted to search the car. He says they would not let him. He says the sheriff was in radio contact with the base. He says they asked where the extra guy came from. He says that confused the sheriff. He says legally they could only hold them about an hour. He says they were held close to the limit. He says the sheriff really wanted to search. He says John made a mistake. He says the sheriff asked for IDs. He says someone said money was in the trunk. John opened the trunk. He says the trunk had the Geiger counters, telescope, sound equipment, video stuff. He says that is when the sheriff decided to keep them longer. He says the sheriff made a comment about the hardware. He says they said yes. He says the next day was a work day for him, but he was taken into debriefing and yelled at. He says he was never allowed to return to S4 after that time. Someone asks if he was fired. Lazar answers, he was never fired. He says they were going to pull his clearance. He says the main reason was he was not progressing further. He says they halted his clearance because his phone was being tapped. He says he signed an order to allow that. He says they were going through his background. He says he did not tell his wife what was going on until later. He says his wife was having an affair with someone on the phone line. He says it was her flight instructor. He says in programs like that, they want family life stable. He says he had no knowledge. He says they were going to wait until the situation resolved. He says during debriefing, they attacked him and pulled out transcripts. He says they told him about the affair. He says that was the last time he went back. As the questions wind down, the interview leaves the sound of a room that wants certainty. But what it gets is an uneven mix, a few technical claims stated with confidence, a long list of unknowns, and a steady insistence from Lazar that most stories people tell are wrong. When we place this 1991 exchange into a quiet archive frame, the meaning is simple. This is what was asked. This is what was answered. This is where the recording is clear. And this is where it is not. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins.